Hello everyone, welcome. Welcome subscribers, welcome followers, welcome everybody. Okay, I'm going to talk about freedom and Eastern Europe, Russia. Let me tell you why. Okay, as you know, this is not a channel that talks about the news as they are happening. Yes, there are many other channels that will give you the news. But I try to, first of all, two things. Give you a break from the news and talk about something completely different, just to give you a break. Or perhaps, because of my background, talk a little bit more philosophically about something, some concept or some work of literature or something that might make sense when you're thinking about and when you're watching the news. Those concepts might make more sense in understanding the news. So this is what happened today and yesterday. In Britain, there is a lot of talk now about some people from a television station that have been fired. There is talk of free speech. There is, and also one very famous YouTuber who has been cancelled and so on. Yeah, okay. So that led me to think about freedom, okay, liberty and so on. At the same time, in Eastern Europe, it looks as if today is the 6th of October 2023. So it looks as if Poland has changed its direction, if not 100%, at least somewhat. The news talk about whether that is because the election is coming in 2 weeks or not. Whatever. Slovakia also, the elections there that have elected a prime minister who wants a termination of the war. Okay, so these two things together, and something else. Because I did an introduction to Oxford once, and I show you just the main things that, the main sites. And I am preparing something in going through the different colleges, but I don't want to be a tour guide, because you can watch that on YouTube. There are many other channels, perhaps. I'm sure there are many channels who are showing you Oxford. I thought about doing it in a different way, because each college of the university has so many famous people, scholars, politicians, thinkers, scientists that have been students at those colleges, that I thought perhaps I should choose one for each college and introduce that person, that author, that perhaps not science, because I'm not very strong there, but perhaps I could try, and as I'm showing you the college, to actually talk about that particular person. So I was going to start with one, All Souls College, which is a fellows college. It's not an undergraduate college, it's for already people who have done their doctorate and so on. One of the famous students there, one of the famous people who've been to All Souls College, is Isaiah Berlin, a philosopher at the beginning of the 20th century. And I thought of him because he was a philosopher who spoke about freedom and liberty. He is famous for John Stuart Mill in the 19th century had spoken about freedom. Yes, so trying to explain that freedom, explaining very well, not trying, he did explain it very well, that freedom is not just doing whatever you want. Your freedom stops at the point at which you are interfering with someone else's freedom. In other words, it's not a free-for-all. We're all free in our societies, but we have to be responsible also and respectful of other people's rights too. Okay, and Isaiah Berlin expanded it a little bit more, and he spoke of positive and negative freedom. The two words are not very good, because when you say negative, it sounds bad already. But he was trying to differentiate between the freedom to do something. I have the freedom to criticize the government because I live in a democratic system of government. The freedom to, and freedom from. I have the freedom from not having to be arrested by the government if I say something against them. Do you see? Freedom to, freedom from. And I thought, okay, I'm going to try to do something about this while I'm walking around All Souls College. But lo and behold, I find, I'm looking at Isaiah Berlin and work and different things, and I find a very interesting introduction to the autobiography of a Russian author from the 18th century. His name was Alexander Herzen, H-E-R-Z, or E-N. He was, I have it, 1812 to 1870. And Isaiah Berlin wrote a marvelous introduction to this autobiography, translated. I usually go to old translations, not the very new ones, translated by Professor Duff, who was a classical fellow at Trinity College. I will take you to Trinity College. Oh no, Trinity College, Cambridge, not Oxford. Okay. 1860 to 1940. I find that the translations from these authors up to the Second World War are much better than the new ones. These people were scholars. They knew their Greek, their Latin, their Hebrew, and I like them better. And also the language is a little bit more weighty. So I find that Isaiah Berlin has written this lovely introduction to this book about this author. And why am I interested in this author? Because it's an amazing story. He's Russian, but he's not the typical Russian who was a serf and he was beaten up and he learned through suffering. No, he is a member of the aristocracy, the aristocratic class, as high up as you can possibly get, because his father was actually a relative of the Romanovs and everything. And he ended up being, getting, as all young men do, especially at that time, a revolutionary, a sort of a socialistic ideas, although he was not a socialist. He's very careful to explain the difference. But anyway, a revolutionary type of guy. And he ends up in prison in Siberia and all that. But the fascinating thing about him is that he is talking as an aristocrat, and he's a marvelous storyteller too. And you begin to see how he's becoming aware, little by little, of other people beneath him. Remember, this is when they still had serfdom in Russia. The serfs were not freed until 1861. Okay, and he's writing in the 1830s. This is, the master and the serfs, And he's becoming aware of how unjust society is, and how these people had no one to turn to, and so on. And it's a marvelous, you can see it throughout his autobiography. I only read half of it. But so I'm going to share it with you because it brings together a sense of freedom from Isaiah Berlin, Russia and Eastern Europe. Let me just read you one little paragraph. He says in sometime in the middle of the book, he says, and this applies to Europe, Eastern Europe, I think, and not only Russia and Eastern Europe. It applies to other European countries. But he's talking specifically about Russia here, 1830s, okay? Our attitude towards Europe and Europeans is still that of provincials, towards the dwellers in a capital. We are servile and apologetic, take every difference for a defect, blush for our peculiarities, and try to hide them, and confess our inferiority by imitation. The fact is that we are intimidated. We have never got over the sneers of Peter the Great and his coadjutors, or the superior airs of French tutors and Germans in our civil service. Western nations talk of our duplicity and cunning. They believe we want to deceive them, and we are only trying to make a creditable appearance and pass muster. Okay, so he's very perceptive, okay? So let me first tell you what Isaiah Berlin says. I'll just skip through a few things. He says, as an introduction to this author, Alexander Herzen is the most arresting Russian political writer in the 19th century. No good biographers of him exist, perhaps because his own autobiography is a great literary masterpiece. Alexander Ivanovich Herzen was born in Moscow in 1812, not long before the capture of the city by Napoleon. The illegitimate, this is going to be important in his life, the illegitimate son of Ivan Yakovlev, a rich and well-born Russian gentleman, descended from a cadet branch of the Romanovs, a morose, difficult, possessive, distinguished and civilized man who bullied his son, loved him deeply too, embittered his life, and had an enormous influence upon him both by attraction and repulsion. His mother, Louisa Haag, was a mild German lady from Stuttgart in Württemberg, the daughter of a minor official. Ivan Yakovlev had met her while traveling abroad, but never married her. He took her to Moscow, established her as mistress of his household, and called his son Herzen in token, as it were, of the fact that he was the child of his heart, but not legitimately born, and therefore not entitled to bear his name. The fact that Herzen was not born in wedlock probably had a considerable effect on his character, and may have made him more rebellious than he might otherwise have been. He received the regular education of a rich and young nobleman, went to the University of Moscow, and he has some funny stories to say about his time as student. And there early asserted his vivid, original, impulsive character. He was born in later years he constantly came back to this, into the generation of what in Russia came to be called superfluous men. The very rich, they had nothing to do. The generation of superfluous men with whom Turgenev's early novels are so largely concerned. Let me see what else he says. These young men have a place of their own in the history of European culture in the 19th century. They belong to the class of those who are by birth aristocratic, but who themselves go over to some freer and more radical mode of thought and of action. There is something singularly attractive about men who retained throughout life the manners, the texture of being, the habits and style of a civilized and refined milieu. Such men exercise a peculiar kind of personal freedom, which combines spontaneity with distinction. Their minds see large and generous horizons, and above all reveal a unique intellectual gaiety of a kind that aristocratic education tends to produce. At the same time, they're intellectually on the side of everything that is new, progressive, rebellious, young, untried, of that which is about to come into being, of the open sea, whether or not there is land that lies beyond. Herzen belonged to this milieu. In his autobiography, he has described what it was like to be this kind of man in a suffocating society, where there was no opportunity of putting to use one's natural gifts, what it meant to be excited by novel ideas which came drifting in from all kinds of sources, from classical texts and the old utopias of the West, from French social preachers and German philosophers, from books, journals, casual conversations, only to remember that the milieu in which one lived made it absurd even to begin to dream of creating in one's own country those harmless and moderate institutions which had long become forms of life in the civilized West. These normally led to one of two results. One of two. Either the young enthusiast simply subsided and came to terms with reality and became a wistful, gently frustrated landowner who lived on his estate, turned the pages of serious periodicals imported from Petersburg or abroad, and occasionally introduced new pieces of agricultural machinery or some other ingenious device which had caught his fancy in England or in France. Such enthusiasts would endlessly discuss the need for this or that change, but always with the melancholy implication that little or nothing could or would be done. Or, alternatively, they would give in entirely and fall into a species of gloom or stupor or violent despair, becoming self-devouring neurotics, destructive personalities, slowly poisoning both themselves and the life round them. Herzen was resolved to escape from both these familiar predicaments. He was determined that of him, at any rate, nobody would say that he had done nothing in the world, that he had offered no resistance and collapsed. When he finally emigrated from Russia in 1847, it was to devote himself to a life of activity. His education was that of a dilettante, the intelligentsia, Like most young men brought up in an aristocratic milieu, he had been taught to be too many things to too many men, to reflect too many aspects of life and situations, to be able to concentrate sufficiently upon any one particular activity, any one fixed design. Herzen was well aware of this. He talks wistfully about the good fortunes of those who enter peacefully upon some steady, fixed profession. Untroubled by the many countless alternatives open to gifted and often idealistic young men who have been taught too much, are too rich, and are offered altogether too wide an opportunity of doing too many things, and who consequently begin and then are bored and go back and start down a new path, and in the end lose their way and drift aimlessly and achieve nothing. This was a very characteristic piece of self-analysis, filled with the idealism of his generation in Russia that both sprang from and fed the growing sense of guilt towards the people. Herzen was passionately anxious to do something memorable for himself and his country, and this anxiety remained with him all his life. He says in one of his essays, one of his forgotten essays that he wrote at the beginning of the 1840s, he distinguished between what he called dilettantism and Buddhism in science. Buddhism in science. Here he distinguishes two kinds of intellectual personality, against both of which he inveighs. One is that of the casual amateur who never sees the trees for the wood, who is terrified, Herzen tells us, of losing his own precious individuality in too much pedantic preoccupation with actual detailed facts, and therefore always skims over the surface without developing a capacity for real knowledge, who looks at the facts, as it were, through a kind of telescope, with the result that nothing ever gets articulated save enormous sonorous generalizations floating at random like so many balloons. And the other kind of student, the Buddhist in science, is the person who escapes from the wood by frantic absorption in the trees, who becomes an intense student of some tiny set of isolated facts which he views through more and more powerful microscopes. Although such a man might be deeply learned in some particular branch of knowledge, almost invariably, and particularly if he is a German, and almost all of Herzen jibes and insults are directed against the hated Germans, and that despite the fact that he was half German himself. Anyway, he becomes intolerably, this kind of person, he becomes intolerably tedious, pompous, and blindly Philistine. Above all, always repellent as a human being. He believes that between these two poles it is necessary to find some compromise. So his fundamental thesis is that which he developed throughout his later life with marvelous poetry and imagination, is the terrible power of human lives of ideological abstractions. He's going to be very strong on saying that he puts it in many different ways, but basically he always ends up criticizing the fact that people will have ideologies, political ideologies, And then, which are theories about the perfect life or some utopia or something, it's always for the good of mankind. And then when it doesn't quite work because they haven't figured in human nature, then they become authoritarian because they had to fit. I truly believe that this is right. They have to fit human nature into their theory rather than fit the theory to what human nature is. Yes, so he's very strong on that. He keeps repeating it. Herzen declares that any attempt to explain human conduct in terms of or to dedicate human being to the service of any abstraction, be it never so noble, justice, progress, nationality, always leads in the end to victimization and human sacrifice. That is what he calls it, human sacrifice. Men are not simple enough. Human lives and relationships are too complex for standard formulas and neat solutions, and attempts to adapt individuals and fit them into a rational schema of things, conceived in terms of a theoretical model, a theoretical ideal, be the motives for doing it never so lofty, always lead in the end to a terrible maiming of human beings. The process culminates in the liberation of some only at the price of the enslavement of others, and the replacing of an old tyranny with a new one, and sometimes far more hideous because it's not so visible. So I thought that this, when I was reading this, I said, this is what is happening today. So I think it's, I said I'm going to read his autobiography. The goal of life is life itself. That he says that to sacrifice the present to some vague and unpredictable future is a form of delusion, which leads to the destruction of all that alone is valuable in men and societies, to the gratuitous sacrifice of the flesh and blood of live human beings upon the altar of idealistic abstractions. The notion that there is a splendid future in store for humanity that is guaranteed by history, and that it justifies the most appalling cruelties in the present, this familiar piece of political eschatology based on belief in inevitable progress, seemed to him a fatal doctrine directed against human life. Okay, these are some of the things. He says, for example, we think that the purpose of the child is to grow up because it does grow up. But its purpose is to play, to enjoy itself, to be a child. If we merely look to the end of the process, the purpose of all life is death. So this is Herzen's central political and social thesis. He says the purpose of the singer is the song, and the purpose of life is to be lived. Everything passes, but what passes may sometimes reward the pilgrims for all his sufferings. Goethe has told us that there can be no guarantee, no security. Man could be content with the present, but he is not. He rejects beauty. He rejects fulfillment today because he must own the future also. That is Herzen's answer to all those who, like Mazzini and other socialists of his time, called for supreme sacrifices and sufferings for the sake of nationality, of human civilization, of socialism, of justice, of humanity, if not in the present, then in the future. Herzen rejects this violently. The purpose of the struggle for liberty is not liberty tomorrow. It is liberty today, the liberty of living individuals with their own individual ends, the ends for which they move and fight and perhaps die, ends which are sacred to them. To crush their freedom, their pursuits, to ruin their ends for the sake of some vague felicity in the future which cannot be guaranteed, about which we know nothing, which is simply the product of some enormous metaphysical construction that itself rests upon sand, for which there is no logical or empirical or any other rational guarantee. To do that is, in the first place, blind, because the future is uncertain, and in the second place, vicious, because it offends against the only moral values we know, because it tramples on human demands in the name of abstractions, freedom, happiness, justice, generalizations, mystical sounds, idolized sets of words. Why is liberty valuable? Because it is an end in itself, because it is what it is. To bring it as a sacrifice to something else is simply to perform an act of human sacrifice. Okay. Isaiah Berlin continues. Stay with me because this is... I'm going to give you some examples of how he writes. He writes about his father. He writes about the peasants and the serfs. Very movingly, with examples, and he will say things like, I will tell you just one example about what I mean. One day we were all at dinner, and then he tells you the story, and it's wonderful. Anyway, let me continue just a little bit longer with the introduction. He is terrified of the oppressors, but he is terrified of the liberators too. He's terrified of them because for him they are the secular heirs of the religious bigots of the ages of the past, because anybody who has a cut and dried scheme, a straitjacket which he wishes to impose on humanity as the sole possible remedy for all human ills, is ultimately bound to create a situation intolerable for free human beings. Okay, let me... Isaiah Berlin goes for quite a bit longer. Let me see if I can find some nice excerpts from him. Okay, so he starts with, as a little child, his nursery and so on. First of all, I'll just take excerpts, okay, for you to see what kind of writer he is. Childhood, youth, and exile. Okay. The difference between he says, this is the author, Herzen himself, writing. The difference between the class of nobles and the class of servants is not great. Remember, they had in his house, they had about 60 servants. There was only him as a child. Okay, 60 servants. Okay. Imagine the wealth. Okay, the difference between the class of nobles and the class of servants is not great. I hate, especially since the calamities of the year 1848, revolutions, Democrats who flatter the mob, but I hate still more aristocrats who slander the people by representing those who serve them as degenerate animals, treating them like that. Slave owners throw dust in the eyes of others and stifle the protests of their own consciences. In few cases are we better, we the aristocrats. In few cases are we better than the common people, but we express our feelings with more consideration, and we are cleverer at concealing selfish and evil passions. Our desires are not so coarse or so obvious, owing to the easiness of satisfying them and the habitual absence of self-restraint. We are merely richer, better fed, and therefore more difficult to please. When Count Almaviva in The Barber of Seville, the opera, when Count Almaviva named to the Barber of Seville all the qualifications he required in a servant, Figaro said with a sigh, "If a servant must possess all these merits, it will be hard to find masters who are fit for a servant's place." In Russia in general, moral corruption is not deep. It might truly enough be called savage even, dirty, noisy, coarse, disorderly, shameless, but it is mainly on the surface. The clergy, in the concealment of their houses, eat and drink to excess with the merchant class. The nobles get drunk in the light of day, gamble recklessly, strike their men servants, and run after the maids, mismanage their affairs, and fail even worse as husbands and fathers. The official class are as bad in a dirtier way. They curry favor, besides, with their superiors, and they are all petty thieves. The nobles do really steal less. They take openly what does not belong to them, though without prejudice to other methods when circumstances are favorable. The misconduct of most servants is of a simple kind and turns on trifles, a glass of spirits or a bottle of beer that they might steal, a chat over a pipe when they should be working. He's talking in the 1830s. Absence from the house without leave, quarrels which sometimes proceed as far as blows, or deception of their master when he requires of them more than man can perform. They are as ignorant as the peasants, but more sophisticated, and this, together with their servile condition, accounts for much that is perverted and distorted in their character. But in spite of all this, they remain grown-up children. Trifles make them laugh or weep. Their desires are limited and deserve to be called simple and natural rather than vicious. Spirits and tea and the public house and the tea shop, these are the invariable vices of a servant in Russia today. For them he steals, because of them he is poor. For their sake he endures persecution and punishment and leaves his wife and children to beggary. Nothing is easier than to sit like we do and like Father Matthew does. Father Matthew was an Irish priest who preached temperance in the middle of the 19th century. Nothing easier than to sit like Father Matthew in the seat of judgment and condemn drunkenness, while you are yourself intoxicated with sobriety. He moves on to another point. In former days there existed, it still exists in Turkey, a feudal bond of affection between the Russian landowner and his household servant. But the race of such servants devoted to the family as a family is now extinct with us. The reason of this is obvious. The landowner has ceased to believe in his own authority. He does not believe that he will answer at the dreadful day of judgment for his treatment of his people, and he abuses his power for his own advantage, no longer thinking of the whole household, but just him. The servant, therefore, does not believe in his inferiority anymore, and so he endures oppression not as a punishment or trial inflicted by God, but merely because he is defenseless. But I knew in my young days, he says, 2 or 3 specimens of that boundless loyalty that you can no longer find, obviously, which old gentlemen of 70 sometimes recall with a sigh. They speak of the wonderful zeal of devotion of their servants, but they never mention the return which they and their fathers made to that faithfulness. There was Andrei Stepanov, whom I knew as a decrepit old man, spending his last days on very short commons on an estate belonging to my uncle, the senator. When my father and uncle were young men in the army, he was their valet, a kind, honest, sober man who guessed what his young masters wanted, and they wanted a good deal. And he guessed it just by a mere look at their faces. I know this from themselves, they told me. Later, he was in charge of an estate near Moscow. The year of 1812, Napoleon, cut him off at once from all communications. The village was burned down, and he lived on there alone and without money, and finally sold some wood to save himself from starvation. When my uncle returned to Russia, he went into the state accounts and discovered the sale of wood, and punishment followed. The man was disgraced and removed from his office, though he was old and burdened with a family. We often passed through the village where he lived and spent a day or 2 there now, and the old man, now paralyzed and walking on crutches, never failed to visit us in order to make his bow to my father and talk to him. I was deeply touched by the simple devotion of his language and by his miserable appearance. I remember the tufts of hair between yellow and white which covered both sides of his bare scalp. "They tell me, sir," he said once to my father, "that your brother," the man who had fired him, "they tell me, sir," he said once to my father, "that your brother has received another order." A distinction. "I am getting old, father, and shall soon give back my soul to God. But I wish God would suffer me to see your brother wearing his order. Just once before I die, I would like to see him with his ribbon and all his glory. My eyes were on the old man, and everything about him showed that he was speaking the truth. His expression as frank as a child's, his bent figure, his crooked face, dim eyes, and feeble voice. There was no falsehood or flattery there. He did really wish to see, once more before he died, the man who for 14 years had never forgiven him for that wood. Should I call him a saint or a madman? Are there any who attain to sanctity except madmen? So he tells us lots of stories about his another story. Our old footman, Bakai was his name, an extremely interesting character, was an instance of this kind. I don't know what kind it is. A tall man of athletic build, with large and dignified features, and an air of the profoundest reflection. He lived to an old age in the belief that a footman's place is one of singular dignity. This respectable old man was constantly out of temper, or half drunk, or both together. He idealized his duties, though, the duties of his office, and attributed them a solemn importance. He could lower the steps of a carriage with a peculiarly loud rattle. When he banged a carriage door, he made more noise than the report of a gun. He stood on the rumble surly and straight, and every time that a hole in the road gave him a jolt, he called out to the coachman, "Easy there," in a deep voice of displeasure, though the hole was by that time 5 yards behind the carriage. His chief occupation, other than going out with the carriage, was self-imposed. It consisted in training the pantry boys in the standard of manners demanded by the servants' hall. As long as he was sober, this went well enough, but when he was affected by liquor, he was severe and exacting beyond belief. I sometimes tried to protect my young friends. He was always friendly with the servants' kids. But my authority had little weight with the Roman firmness of Bakai. He would open the door that led to the drawing room with the words, "This is not your place. I beg you to go, or I shall carry you out." Not a movement, not a word on the part of the boys did he let pass unrebuked, and he often accompanied his words with a smack on the head or a painful fillip which he inflicted by an ingenious and spring-like manipulation of his finger and thumb. When he had at last driven the boys from the room and was left alone, he transferred his attention to his only friend, a large Newfoundland dog called Macbeth, whom he fed and brushed and petted and loved. After sitting alone for a few minutes, he would go down to the courtyard and invite Macbeth to join him in the pantry. And then he began to talk to his friend. "Foolish brute, what makes you sit outside in the frost when there is warmth in here? Well, what are you staring at? Can't you answer?" And the questions were generally followed by a smack on the head. Macbeth occasionally growled at his benefactor, and then Bakai reproved him with no weak fondness. "Do what you like for a dog it still remains. It shows its teeth at you with never a thought of who you are. But for me, the fleas would eat you up. and then, hurt by his friend's ingratitude, he would take snuff angrily and throw what was left on his fingers at Macbeth's nose. The dog would sneeze, make incredibly awkward attempts to get the snuff out of his eyes with his paw, rise in high dudgeon from the bench, and begin scratching at the door. Buckeye opened the door and dismissed the dog with a kick and a final word of reproach. At this point, the pantry boys generally came back, and the sound of his knuckles on their heads began again. We had another dog before Macbeth, a setter called Bertha. When she became very ill, Buckeye put her on his bed and nursed her for some weeks. Early one morning I went into the servants' hall. Buckeye tried to say something, but his voice broke and a large tear rolled down his cheek. The dog was dead. There is another fact for the student of human nature. I don't at all suppose that he hated the pantry boys either, but he had a surly temper which was made worse by drinking bad spirits and unconsciously affected by his surroundings. Such men as Buckeye hugged their chains. But there were others. There passes through my memory a sad procession of hopeless sufferers and martyrs. My uncle had a cook of remarkable skill in his business, a hard-working and sober man who made his way upwards. The Tsar had a famous French chef at the time, and my uncle contrived to secure for his servant admission to the imperial kitchens. After this instruction, the man was engaged by the English club at Moscow, made money, married, and lived like a gentleman. But with the noose of serfdom still round his neck, he was still a serf. He could never sleep easy or enjoy his new position. Alexei, that was his name, at last plucked up courage, had prayers said to Our Lady of Iberia, and called on my uncle and offered 5,000 rubles for his freedom. But his master was proud of the cook as his property. He was proud of another man, a painter, for just the same reason, and therefore he refused the money, promising the cook to give him his freedom in his will, without any payment. This was a frightful blow to the man. He became depressed. The expression of his features changed. His hair turned grey, and being a Russian, he took to the bottle. He became careless about his work, and the English club dismissed him. Then he was engaged by the Princess Trubetskoy, and she persecuted him by her petty meanness. Alexei was a lover of fine phrases, and once, when he was insulted by her beyond bearing, he drew himself up and said in his nasal voice, "What a stormy soul inhabits your serene highness body." The princess was furious. She dismissed the man and wrote, as a Russian great lady would, to my uncle to complain of his servant. My uncle would rather have done nothing, but out of politeness to the lady, he sent for the cook and scolded him and told him to go and beg pardon of the princess. But instead of going there, he went to the public house. And within a year he was utterly ruined. All the money he had saved for his freedom was gone, and even his last kitchen apron. He fought with his wife, and she with him, till at last she went into service as a nurse away from Moscow. Nothing was heard of him for a long time. At last the policeman brought him to our house, a wild and ragged figure. He had no place of abode and wandered from one drink shop to another. The police had picked him up in the street and demanded that his master should take him in hand. My uncle was vexed and perhaps repentant. He received the man kindly enough and gave him a room to live in. Alexei went on drinking. When he was drunk, he was noisy and fancied he was writing poetry. And he really had some imaginative gift, but no control over it. We were in the country at that time, and my uncle sent the man to us, fancying that my father would have some control over him. But the man was too far gone. His case revealed to me, even though I was a child, the concentrated ill feeling and hatred which a serf cherishes in his heart against his masters. He gnashed his teeth as he spoke and used gestures which, especially as coming from a cook, were ominous. My presence did not prevent him from speaking freely, but he was fond of me and often patted my shoulder as he said, "This is a sound branch of a rotten tree." He had a thing with words. He had a way with words. Let me see. When I was 12, I was transferred from the hands of women to those of men. And about that time, my father made 2 unsuccessful attempts to put a German in charge of me. A German in charge of children is neither a tutor nor a uncle. Uncle meaning like a guide, part of the family. Diatka. It is quite a profession by itself. He does not teach or dress the children himself, but sees that they are dressed and taught. He watches over their health, takes them out for walks, and talks whatever nonsense he pleases, provided that it is in German. He doesn't like German. If there is a tutor in the house, the German is his inferior. But he takes precedence of the uncles, if there is one. The visiting teachers, if they come late from unforeseen causes, or leave too early or into circumstances beyond their control, are polite to the German. And though quite uneducated, he begins to think himself a man of learning. The governesses make use of the German to do all sorts of errands for them, but never permit any attentions on his part unless they suffer from positive deformity and see no prospect of any other admirers. That's the only time when they'll accept something from the German. When boys are 14, they go off to the German's room to smoke on the sly, and he allows it because he needs powerful assistance if he is to keep his place. Indeed, the common practice is to dismiss him at this period after thanking him in the presence of the boys and presenting him with a watch. If he is tired of taking children out and receiving reprimands when they catch cold or stain their clothes, then the German in charge of children becomes a German without qualification. He starts a small shop where he sells amber mouthpieces or the cologne and cigars to his former charges and performs secret services for them of another kind. The first German attached to my person was a native of Silesia, and his name was Jokisch. In my opinion, his name alone was a sufficient disqualification. He was a tall, bald man who professed a knowledge of agriculture, and I believe that this fact induced my father to take him. But his chief distinction was his extreme need of soap and water. I looked with aversion at the Silesian giant and only consented to walk about with him in the parks and gardens on condition that he told me improper stories, which I retailed in the servants' hall. He did not survive more than a year. He was guilty of some misconduct on our country's estate, and a gardener tried to kill him with a scythe, and this made my father order him to clear out. His successor was Fedor Karlovich, a soldier, probably a deserter actually, from Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, who was remarkable for his beautiful handwriting and excessive stupidity. He had filled a similar post twice already and had gained some experience, so that he gave himself the airs of a tutor. Also, he spoke French, mispronouncing the je with a je, and misplacing the accents. I had no kind of respect for him, but poisoned every moment of his existence, especially after I was convinced that, in spite of all my efforts, he was unable to understand either decimal fractions or the rule of 3. In most boys' hearts there is a good deal that is ruthless and even cruel, I admit, and I persecuted the Jacker of Wolfenbüttel unmercifully, with sums in proportion. I was so much interested by this that, though I did not often speak on such subjects to my father, I solemnly informed him of the stupidity of Fedor Karlovich. He once boasted to me of a new frock coat, dark blue with gold buttons, and I actually saw him once wearing it. He was going to a wedding, and the coat, though it was too large for him, really had gold buttons. But the boy who waited on the German informed me that the garment was borrowed from a friend who kept a perfumer's shop. Without the least feeling of pity, I attacked my victim and asked him bluntly where his blue coat was. There is a great deal of moth in this house, and I have given it to a tailor whom I know to keep it safe for me. Where does the tailor live? I asked. What business is that of yours? Why not say? People should mind their own business. Oh, very well, but my birthday is next week, and to please me, you might get the blue coat from the tailor for that day. No, I won't. You don't deserve it after your rudeness. He had rented it. He had to take it back. Oh dear. To the encouragement and approval from my teachers, there was soon added a still warmer sympathy which had a profound influence upon me. In a little town of the government of Tver lived a granddaughter of my father's eldest brother. Her name was Tatiana Kuchin. I had known her from childhood, but we seldom met. Once a year at Christmas, she came to pay a visit to her aunt at Moscow, but we had become close friends. Though 5 years my senior, she was short for her age and looked no older than myself. My chief reason for getting to like her was that she was the first person to talk to me in a reasonable way. I mean, she did not constantly express surprise at my growth. She did not ask what lessons I did and whether I did them well, whether I intended to enter the army, and if so, what regiment. But she talked to me as most sensible people talk to one another, though she kept the little airs of superiority which all girls like to show to boys a little younger than themselves. We corresponded, especially after the events of 1824, but letters mean paper and pen, and recall the schoolroom table with its ink stains and decorations carved with a penknife. I wanted to see her and to discuss our new ideas, and it may be imagined with what delight I heard that my cousin was to come in February of 1826 and to spend several months with us. I scratched the calendar on my desk and struck off the days as they passed, sometimes abstaining for a day or two just to have the satisfaction of striking out more at one time. In spite of this, the time seemed very long, and when it came to an end, her visit was postponed more than once. Such is the way of things. One evening, I was sitting in the schoolroom with Protopopov, must be one of the teachers. Over each item of instruction he took, as usual, a sip of sour broth. He was explaining the hexameter, ruthlessly hashing with voice and hand each verse of the Gnedich translation of the Iliad into its separate feet. Suddenly a sound unlike that of town sledges came from the snow outside. I heard the faint tinkle of harness bells and the sound of voices outdoors. I flushed up, lost all interest in the hashing process and the wrath of Achilles, and rushed headlong to the front hall. There was my cousin from Tiver, wrapped up in furs, shawls, and comforters, and wearing a hood and white fur boots. Blushing red with frost and perhaps also with joy, she ran into my arms. Most people speak of their early youth, its joys and sorrows, with a slightly condescending smile, as if they wished to say, like the affected lady in Griboyedov's play, "How childish!" Children, when a few years are past, are ashamed of their toys, and this is right enough. They want to be men and women. They grow so fast and change so much, as they see by their jackets and the pages of their lesson books. But adults might surely realize that childhood and the 2 or 3 years of youth are the fullest part of life, the fairest and the most truly our own. And indeed they are possibly the most important part, because they fix all that follows, though we are not aware of it. So long as a man moves modestly forwards, never stopping and never reflecting, and until he comes to the edge of a precipice or breaks his neck, he continues to believe that his life lies ahead of him. And therefore he looks down upon his past and is unable to appreciate the present. But when experience has laid low the flowers of spring and chilled the glow of summer, when he discovers that life is practically over, and all that remains a mere continuance of the past, then he feels differently towards the brightness and warmth and beauty of early recollections. Nature deceives us all with her endless tricks and devices. She makes us a gift of youth, and then, when we are grown up, asserts her mastery and snares us in a web of relations, domestic and public, most of which we are powerless to control. And though we impart our personal character to our actions, we do not possess our souls in the same degree. The lyric element of personality is weaker, and with it, our feelings and capacity for enjoyment. All indeed is weaker, except intelligence and will. My cousin's life was no bed of roses. She lost her mother in childhood. Her father was a passionate gambler who, like all men who have gambling in their blood, was constantly rich and poor by turns, and ended by ruining himself. What was left of his fortune he devoted to his stud, which now became the object of all his thoughts and desires. His only son, a good-natured cavalry officer, was taking the shortest road to ruin. At the age of 19, he was a more desperate gambler than his father. When the father was 50, he married, for no obvious reasons, an old maid who was a teacher in the Smolny convent. She was the most typical specimen of a Petersburg governess whom I had ever happened to meet. Thin, blonde, and very short-sighted, she looked the teacher and the moralist all over. By no means stupid, she was full of an icy enthusiasm in her talk. She abounded in commonplaces about virtue and devotion. She knew history and geography by heart, spoke French with a repulsive correctness, and concealed a high opinion of herself under an artificial and Jesuitical humility. These traits are common to all pedants in petticoats. But she had others peculiar to the capital of the convent. Thus she raised tearful eyes to heaven when speaking of the visit of the mother of us all, the Empress Maria Fedorovna. She was in love with Tsar Alexander and carried a locket or ring containing a fragment of a letter from the Empress Elizabeth. It is easy to imagine the harmonious trio that made up this household. A card-playing father, passionately devoted to horses and racing and noisy carousels in disreputable company. A daughter brought up in complete independence and accustomed to do as she pleased in the house. And a middle-aged blue-stocking suddenly converted into a bride. As a matter of course, no love was lost between the stepmother and stepdaughter. In general, real friendship between a woman of 35 and a girl of 17 is impossible, unless the former is sufficiently unselfish to renounce all claim to sex. The common hostility between stepmother and stepdaughter does not surprise me in the least. It is natural and even moral. A new member of the household who usurps the mother's place provokes repulsion on the part of the children. To them, the second marriage is a second funeral. The child's love is revealed in this feeling and whispers to the orphan, "Your father's wife is not your mother." At one time, the Church understood that a second marriage is inconsistent with the Christian conception of marriage and the Christian dogma of immortality, but she made constant concessions to the world and went too far till she came up against the logic of facts, the simple heart of the child who revolts against the absurdity and refuses the name of mother to his father's second choice. The woman too is in an awkward situation when she comes away from the altar to find a family of children ready-made. She has nothing to do with them and has to force feelings which she cannot possess. She is bound to convince herself and the world that other people's children are just as attractive to her as her own. Consequently, I don't blame either the convent lady or my cousin for their mutual dislike, but I understand how a young girl unaccustomed to control was eager to go wherever she could be free. Her father was now getting old and more submissive to his learned wife. Her brother, the officer, was behaving worse and worse. In fact, the atmosphere at home was oppressive, and she finally induced her stepmother to let her go on a visit to us for some months or possibly for a year. The day after her arrival, my cousin turned my usual routine, with the exception of my lessons, upside down. With a high hand, she fixed hours for us to read together, advised me to stop reading novels, and recommended Segur's General History and the travels of the Anarchastes. From the ascetic point of view, she opposed my strong inclination to smoke on the sly. Cigarettes were then unknown, and I rolled the tobacco in paper myself. In general, she liked to preach to me, and I listened meekly to her sermons, if I did not profit by them. Fortunately, she was not consistent. Quite forgetting her own arrangement, she read with me for amusement rather than instruction, and often sent out a secret messenger in the shape of a pantry boy to buy buckwheat cakes in winter or gooseberries in summer. I believe that her influence on me was very good. She brought into my monastic life an element of warmth, and this may have served to keep alive the enthusiasms that were beginning to stir in my mind when they might easily have been smothered by my father's ironical tone. I learned to be attentive, to be nettled by a single word, to care for a friend, and to feel affection. I learned also to talk about feelings. In her, I found support for my political ideas. She prophesied a remarkable future and reputation for me, and I, with a child's vanity, believed her when she said I would one day be Brutus or Fabricius. To me alone she confided the secret of her love for a cavalry officer in a black jacket and all man. It was really a secret, for the officer, as he rode at the head of his squadron, never suspected the pure little flame that burnt for him in the breast of this young lady of 18. Whether I envied him, I can't say. Probably I did a little, but I was proud of being chosen as a confidant, and I imagine, under the influence of Werther, that this was a tragic passion, fated to end in some great catastrophe involving suicide by poison or the dagger. I even thought at times of calling on the officer and telling him the whole story. My cousin brought shuttlecocks, birdies, with her from home. One of them had a pin stuck into it, and she always used it in playing. If anyone else happened to get hold of it, she took it away and said that no other suited her as well. But the demon of mischief, which was always whispering its temptations in my ear, tempted me to take out this pin and stick it into another shuttlecock. The trick was entirely successful. My cousin always chose the shuttlecock with the pin in it. After a fortnight, I told her what I had done. She changed color, burst out crying, and ran to her own room. I was frightened and distressed. After waiting half an hour, I went to find her. Her door was locked, and I asked her to open it. She refused, saying that she was not well and that I was an unkind, heartless boy. Then I wrote a note in which I begged her to forgive me, and after tea we made it up. I kissed her hand, and she embraced me, and I explained the full importance of the incident. A year before, she explained the full importance of the incident, and that was because a year before, the officer had dined at their house and played battledore with her afterwards. And the marked shuttlecock had been used by him. And then I felt very remorseful, as if I had committed a real act of sacrilege. My cousin stayed with us till October, when her father summoned her home, promising to let her spend the next summer with us in the country. We looked forward with horror to the separation, and soon there came an autumn day when a carriage arrived to fetch her, and her maid carried down baskets and bandboxes, while other servants put in provisions of all kinds to last the week, and crowded to the steps to say their goodbyes. We exchanged a close embrace, and both shed tears. The carriage drove out into the street, turned into a side street close to the very shop where we used to buy the cakes, and disappeared. I took a turn in the courtyard, but it seemed cold and unfriendly. My own room, where I went next, seemed empty and cold too. I began to prepare a lesson, and all the time I was thinking, where is the carriage now? Has it passed the gates or not? I had one comfort. We should spend next June together in the country. Let's talk about his father a little bit. The dullness and monotony of our house became more intolerable with every year. But for the prospect of university life, my new friendship, my interest in politics, and my lovely turn of character, I must either have run away or died of the life. My father was seldom cheerful. As a rule, he was dissatisfied with everyone and everything. He was a man of unusual intelligence and powers of observation, who had seen and heard a great deal and remembered it. He was a finished man of the world and could be exceedingly pleasant and interesting, but he did not choose to be so, and sank deeper and deeper into a state of morbid solitude. What precisely it was that infused so much bile and bitterness into his blood, it is hard to say. No period of passion, of great misfortunes, mistakes, and losses had ever taken place in his life. I could never fully understand the source of that bitter scorn and irritation which filled his heart, of his distrust and avoidance of mankind, and of the disgust that preyed upon him. Perhaps he took with him to the grave some recollection which he never confided to any ear. Perhaps it was merely due to the combination of two things so incongruous as the 18th century and Russian life. And there was a third factor, the traditional idleness of his class, which had the terrible power of producing unreasonable tempers. In Europe, especially in France, The 18th century produced an extraordinary type of man which combined all the weaknesses of the Regency with all the strength of Spartans or Romans. Half like Faublas and half like Regulus, these men opened with the doors of revolution and were the first to rush into it, jostling one another in their haste to pass out by the window of the guillotine. Our age has ceased to produce those strong, complete natures, but last century evoked them everywhere, even in countries where they were not needed and where their development was bound to be distorted. In Russia, men who were exposed to the influence of this powerful European current did not make history, but they became unlike other men. Foreigners at home and foreigners abroad, spoiled for Russia by European prejudices and for Europe by Russian habits, they were a living contradiction in terms and sunk into an artificial life of sensual enjoyment and monstrous egoism. Such was the most conspicuous figure at Moscow in those days. Prince Yusupov, a Tartar prince, a grand seigneur of European reputation, and a Russian grandee of brilliant intellect and great fortune. He was surrounded by a whole plate of grey-haired Don Juans and freethinkers such as Masalsky, Santi, and the rest. They were all men of considerable mental development and culture, but they had nothing to do, and they rushed after pleasure, loved and petted their precious selves, genially gave themselves absolution for all their transgressions, exalted the love of eating to the height of a platonic passion, and lowered love for women into a kind of gluttonous Epicureanism. Old Yusupov was a skeptic and a bon vivant. He had been the friend of Voltaire and Beaumarchais, of Diderot and Casti, and his artistic taste was beyond question. Okay, talking about his father, I'll jump a little bit. By his education and service in the Guards, by his birth and connections, my father belonged to the same circle, but neither temperament nor health allowed him to lead a life of dissipation to the age of 70, and he went to the opposite extreme. He determined to secure a life of solitude and found it intensely tedious, all the more tedious because he had sought it merely for his own sake. A strong will was degraded into stubborn willfulness, and unused powers spoiled his temper and made it difficult. At the time of his education, European civilization was so new in Russia that a man of culture necessarily became less of a Russian. To the end of his life, he wrote French with more ease and correctness than Russian, and he literally never read a Russian book, not even the Bible. The Bible, indeed, he did not read even in other languages. He knew by hearsay and from extracts the matter of Holy Scripture in general and felt no curiosity to examine further. He did not respect Deshavin and Krylov, the first because he had written an ode on the death of his uncles, Prince Merchersky, and the latter because they had acted together as seconds in a duel. When my father heard that the Emperor Alexander was reading Karamzin's History of the Russian Empire, he tried it himself but soon laid it aside. Nothing but old Slavonic names. Who can take an interest in all that? Such was his disparaging criticism. His contempt for mankind was unconcealed and without exceptions. Never, under any circumstances, did he rely on anyone, and I don't remember that he ever preferred a considerable request in any quarter, and he never did anything to oblige other people. All he asked of others was to maintain appearances, good manners. His moral code consisted of these alone. He excused much, or rather shut his eyes too much, but any breach of decent forms enraged him to such a degree that he became incapable of the least indulgence or sympathy. I puzzled so long over this unfairness that I ended my understanding it. He was convinced beforehand that any man is capable of any bad action, and refrains from it only because he does not pay or for want of opportunity. But in any breach of politeness he found personal offense and disrespect to himself, or middle-class breeding, which, in his opinion, excluded a man from all decent society. The heart of man, he used to say, is hidden, and nobody knows what another man feels. I have too much business of my own to attend to other people, let alone judging their motives. But I cannot live in the same room with an ill-bred man. He offends me. Otherwise he may be the best man in the world. If so, he will go to heaven, but I have no use for him. The most important thing in life, more important than soaring intellect or erudition, is savoir-vivre, to do the right thing always, never to thrust yourself forward, to be perfectly polite to everyone and familiar with nobody. All impulsiveness and frankness my father disliked and called familiarity, and all display of feeling passed with him for sentimentality. He regularly represented himself as superior to all such trivialities, but what that higher object was, for the sake of which he sacrificed his feelings, I have no idea. And when this proud old man, with his clear understanding and sincere contempt of mankind, played this part of a passionless judge, whom did he mean to impress by the performance? A woman? Hold on. A woman whose will he had broken, though she never tried to oppose him. A boy whom his own treatment drove from mere naughtiness to positive disobedience, and a score of footmen whom he did not reckon as human beings. And how much strength and endurance was spent for this object, how much persistence, how surprising the consistency with which the part was played to the very end, in spite of old age and disease. The heart of man is indeed hidden. At the time of my arrest, many years later, and later when I was going into exile, I saw that the old man's heart was much more open than I supposed to love and even to tenderness. But I never thanked him for this, for I did not know how he would have taken my thanks. As a matter of course, he was not happy, always on his guard, discontented with everyone. He suffered when he saw the feelings he inspired in every member of the household. Smile died away, and talk stopped whenever he came into the room. He spoke of this with mockery and resented it, but he made no concession whatever and went his own way with steady perseverance. Stinging mockery and cool, contemptuous irony were the weapons with which he could wield with the skill of an artist, and he used them equally against us and against the servants. There are few things that a growing boy resents more. And in fact, Up to the time of my imprisonment, I was on bad terms with my father and carried on a petty warfare against him with the men and maids for my allies. For the rest, he had convinced himself that he was dangerously ill and was constantly under treatment. He had a doctor resident in the house and was visited by 2 or 3 other physicians, and at least 3 consultations took place each year. His sour looks and constant complaints of his health, which was not really so bad, soon reduced the number of our visitors. He resented this, yet he never remonstrated or invited any friend to the house. An air of terrible boredom reigned in our house, especially in the endless winter evenings. The whole suite of drawing rooms was lit up by a single pair of lamps, and there the old man walked up and down, a stooping figure with his hands behind his back. He wore cloth boots, a velvet skull cap, and a warm jacket of white lambskin. He never spoke a word, and 3 or 4 brown dogs walked up and down with him. As melancholy grew on him, so did his wish to save, but it was entirely misapplied. His management of his land was not beneficial either to himself or to his serfs. The headman and his underlings robbed both their master and the peasants. In certain matters there was strict economy, candle ends were saved, and light French wine was replaced by sour wine from Crimea. On the other hand, a whole forest was felled without his knowledge on one estate, and he paid the market price for his own oats on another. There were men whom he permitted to steal. Thus a peasant who he made collector of the obrok at Moscow, and who was sent every summer to the country to report on the headman and the farm work, the garden and the timber, grew rich enough to buy a house in Moscow after 10 years' service. From childhood I hated this factotum. I was present once when he thrashed an old peasant in our courtyard. In my fury, I caught him by the beard and nearly fainted myself. From that time, I could never bear the sight of him. He died in 1845. Several times I asked my father where this man got the money to buy a house. The result of sober habits, he said. That man never took a drop in his life. Every year, about Shrovetide, our peasants from the government of Penza brought their payments in kind to Moscow. It was a 4-nights journey for the carts, laden with carcasses of pork, sucking pigs, geese, chickens, rye, eggs, butter, and even linen. The arrival of the peasants was a regular field day for all our servants, who robbed and cheated the visitors right and left without any right to do so. The coachman charged for the water their horses drank, and the women charged for a warm place by the fire, while the aristocrats of the servants' hall expected each to get a sucking pig and a piece of cloth, or a goose and some pounds of butter. While the peasants remained in the courtyard, the servants feasted continuously. Soup was always boiling, and sucking pigs roasting, and the servants' hall reeked perpetually of onions and burning fat and bad whiskey. During the last 2 days, Bakai never came into the hall, but sat in the kitchen passage, dressed in an old library overcoat without jacket or waistcoat underneath it. And other servants grew older visibly and darker in complexion. All this my father endured calmly enough, knowing that it must be so and that reform was impossible. These provisions always arrived in a frozen condition, and thereupon my father summoned his cook, Spiridon, and sent him to the markets to inquire about prices. The cook reported astonishingly low figures, lower by half than was actually offered. My father called him a fool and sent for his factotum and a dealer in fruit named Slepuskim. Both expressed horror at the cook's figures, made inquiries, and quoted prices a little higher. Finally, Slepuskin offered to take the whole in a lump, eggs, sucking pigs, butter, rye, and all, to save you, father, from further worry. The price he offered was, of course, a trifle higher than the cook had mentioned. My father consented. To celebrate the occasion, Slepuskin presented him with some oranges and gingerbread, and the cook with a note for 200 rubles. And the most extraordinary part of this transaction was that it was repeated exactly every year. Slepuskin enjoyed my father's favor and often borrowed money of him. And the strange way in which he did it showed his profound knowledge of my father's character. He would borrow 500 rubles for 2 months, and 2 days before payment was due, he would present himself at our house, carrying a currant loaf on a dish and 500 rubles on the top of the loaf. My father took the money, and the borrower bowed low and begged, though unsuccessfully, to kiss his benefactor's hand. But Slepuskin would turn up again a week later and ask for a loan of 1,500 rubles. He got it again and again paid his debt on the nail, and my father considered him a pattern of honesty. A week later, Slepuskin would borrow a still larger sum. Thus, in the course of a year, he secured 5,000 rubles in ready money to use in his business, and for this he paid, by way of interest, a couple of currant loaves, a few pounds of figs and walnuts, and perhaps 100 oranges and Crimean apples. I shall end this subject by relating how my father lost nearly 1,000 acres of valuable timber on one of the estates which had come to him from his brother, the senator. He tells a long story here, but just to finish, that our way of life may be thoroughly understood, I shall describe the whole day from the beginning. They were all alike, and this very monotony was the most killing part of it all. Our life went on like an English clock, with the regulator put back, with a slow and steady movement and a loud tick for each second. At 10 in the morning, the valet who sat in the room next to the bedroom, informed Vera Artamovna, formerly my nurse, that the master was getting up, and she went off to prepare coffee, which my father drank alone in his study. The house now assumed a different aspect. The servants began to clean the rooms, or at least to make a pretense of doing something. The servants' hall, empty till then, began to fill up, and even Macbeth, the big Newfoundland dog, sat down before the stove and stared unwinkingly at the fire. Over his coffee, my father read the Moscow Gazette and the Journal de St. Petersburg. It may be worth mentioning that the newspapers were warmed to save his hands from contact with the damp sheets, and that he read the political news in the French version, finding it clearer than the Russian. For some time he took in the Hamburg Gazette, but could not pardon the Germans for using German print. He often pointed out to me the difference between French and German type, and said that the curly tails of the Gothic letters tried his eyes. Then he ordered the Journal de Frankfurt for a time, but finally contented himself with the native product. In 1840, my father bought the house next to ours, a large and better house with a garden, which had belonged to Countess Rotovskin, wife of the famous governor of Moscow. We moved into it. Then he bought a third house for no reason except that it was adjacent. 2 of these houses stood empty. They were never let because tenants would give trouble at night and might cause fires. Both houses were insured, by the way, and they were never repaired, so that both were in a fair way to fall down. Sonnenberg was permitted to lodge in one of these houses. This is another servant. But on conditions. 1. He must never open the yard gates after 10 p.m. As the gates were never shut, this was an easy condition. And 2. He was to provide firewood at his own expense. He did, in fact, buy it of our coachman. And 3. He was to serve my father as a kind of private secretary, coming in the morning to ask for orders, dining with us, and returning in the evening when there was no company to entertain his employer with conversation and with news. The duties of his place may seem simple enough, but my father contrived to make it so bitter that even Sonnenberg could not stand it continuously, though he was familiar with all the privations that can befall a man with no money and no sense, with a feeble body, a pock-marked face, and German nationality. Every 2 years or so, the secretary declared that his patience was at an end. He packed up his traps, got together by purchase or barter some odds and ends of disputable value and doubtful quality, and started off for the Caucasus. Misfortune dogged him relentlessly. Either his horse, he drove his own horse as far as Tiflis and Redutkail, came down with him in dangerous places inhabited by Don Cossacks, or half his wares were stolen, or his 2-wheel cart broke down and his French scent bottles wasted their sweetness on the broken wheel at the foot of Mount Elbrus. He was always losing something, and when he had nothing else to lose, he lost his passport. Nearly a year would pass, and then Sonnenberg, older, more unkempt, and poorer than before, with fewer teeth and less hair than ever, would turn up humbly at our house with a stock of Persian powder against fleas and bugs, faded silk for dressing gowns, and rusty Circassian daggers. And down he settled once more in the empty house to buy his own firewood and run errands by way of rent. As soon as he noticed Sonnenberg, my father began a little campaign at once. He acknowledged by a bow inquiries as to his health. Then he thought a little and asked, this just as an example of his methods, "Where do you buy your hair oil?" I should say that Sonnenberg, though the plainest of men, thought himself a regular Don Juan. He was careful about his clothes and wore a curling wig of a golden yellow color. "I buy it at Bouy, on the Kuznetsky Bridge," he answered abruptly, rather nettled. And then he placed one foot on the other like a man prepared to defend himself. "And," my father said, "what do you call that scent?" Night violet was the answer. Night violet. The man is cheating you. Violet is a delicate scent, but this stuff is strong and unpleasant, the sort of thing embalmers use for dead bodies. In the weak condition of my nerves, it makes me feel ill. Please tell them to bring me some eau de cologne. Sonnenberg made of himself to fetch the bottle. Oh, no, you'd better call someone. If you come near me yourself, I shall faint. Sonnenberg, who counted on his hair oil to captivate the maids, was deeply injured. When he had sprinkled the room with eau de cologne, my father set about inventing errands. There was French snuff and English magnesia to be ordered, and a carriage advertised for sale to be looked at. Not that my father ever bought anything. Then Sonnenberg bowed and disappeared till dinner time, heartily glad to get away. The next to appear on the scene was the cook. Whatever he had bought or put on the slate, my father always objected to the price. Dear, dear, how high prices are. Is nothing coming in from the country? No, indeed, sir, answered the cook. The roads are very bad just now. Well, you and I must buy less until they are mended. Next, he sat down at his writing table where he wrote orders for his bailiff or examined his accounts and scolded me in the interval of business. He consulted his doctor also, but his chief occupation was to quarrel always with his valet, Nikita. Nikita was a perfect martyr. He was a short, red-faced man with a hot temper, and might have been created on purpose to annoy my father and draw down reproofs upon himself. The scenes that took place between the two every day might have furnished material for a comedy, but it was all serious to them. Knowing that the man was indispensable to him, my father often put up with his rudeness, yet in spite of 30 years of complete failure, he still persisted in lecturing him for his faults. The valet would have found the life unendurable if he had not possessed one means of relief. He was generally tipsy by dinner time. My father, though this did not escape him, did not go beyond indirect allusions to the subject. For instance, he would say that a piece of brown bread and salt prevented a man from smelling of spirits. When Nikita had taken too much, he shuffled his feet in a peculiar way while handling the dishes. And my father, on noticing this, used to invent a message for him at once. For instance, he would send him to the barber's to ask if he had changed his address. Then he would say to me in French, I know he won't go, but he is not sober. He might drop a soup plate and stain the cloth and give me a start. Let him take a turn. The fresh air will do him good. On these occasions, the valet generally made some reply, or, if not, muttered to himself as he left the room. Then my father called him back with unruffled composure and asked him, What did you say to me? I said nothing at all to you. Then who are you talking to? Except you and me, there is nobody else in this room or the next. I was talking to myself. A very dangerous thing. Madness often begins in that way. The valet went off in a fury to his room, which was next to his master's bedroom. There he read the Moscow Gazette and made wigs for sale. Probably to relieve his feelings, he took snuff furiously, and the snuff was so strong, or the membrane of his nose so weak, that he always sneezed 6 or 7 times after a pinch. The master's bell rang, and the valet threw down the hair in his hands and answered the bell. "Was that you sneezing?" "Yes, sir." "Then bless you," and a motion of the hand dismissed the valet. I will leave it there. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.